My name's Jennifer Cantwell and I'm a mid-career maker. I work in textiles and I have a design practice called Sporran Nation, but I also work across mediums in a more experimental way using traditional hand skills like sewing and knitting and combining them with unrelated materials and methods. This show is called Birdsong and I've been working with knitting, sound processing software and mobile phone technology. The patterns on the bird boxes are based on the sound files of birds and ambient sound recorded in different locations in Scotland. I worked with sound designer Dave Martin to record a snapshot of each area, and the sounds were processed using Logic Pro music software, and I worked with the sound waves and the MIDI templates and the velocity peaks, and I worked with them visually, blowing them up, shrinking them, deconstructing, reconstructing them, and I used the colours of the MIDI templates and the velocities in some of the pieces. I was thinking about the far northern knitters of the Fair Isles and Shetland and Norway, and so I wanted to work with stranded knitting, but I adapted the designs for a knitting machine. I've got a 24 stitch repeat punch card knitting machine. It's quite an old piece of technology, but still works well. And I wanted to use that rather than hand knitting. I wanted to use an industrial process, but not an automated process. And I wanted to keep the hand of the maker obvious in the piece, so that it did have a handmade feel rather than a machine-made feel. Sort of a mix of human and machine. The patterns are site-specific. They're a visual representation of the sounds of the area. They're an identifier like a football strip or a school uniform. And they represent each place on a minute and mundane level, really day-to-day, tiny detail. The idea evolved just after I'd moved to Murray, and I was having a random chat about birds having regional accents and singing slightly differently from place to place. And I was reading about fishermen's gansies from the Murray Firth at the time and was hearing lots of Doric being spoken by my partner's family. They were teaching me loads of new words, and that started me off thinking about accents and language and how language travels and spreads, and about regional differences in dialects, words, and how also, if you work in textiles, you're very acutely aware that that's similar in textiles. Each area has its own brand of lace making, embroidery, knitting, its own styles or techniques. And that made me think about how stitches travelled and how styles of making travelled the world on the backs of people in their clothes and in their handwork that they were doing, and patterns spread from area to area. That put me on to thinking about the concept of knitted thumbprints, a knitting pattern that could identify a country or region or individual, and how identity is measured, about where you're from, your homeland, and belonging and movement, birds, migration and communication, about online communities and how data spreads in the virtual world and is used to track movement, information and location. So that was lots of things going on in that train of thought, and what came out of it was the idea of visually branding an area by taking something completely natural from it, like birdsong, and analysing it and turning it into a product using mechanisation and technology. The process involved time out in the field recording the birds and the ambient sounds in 4 different areas. Forests, 10 AM Tuesday, house sparrows in the park and children in the playground. Ullapool, 5 PM Saturday, seagulls and the 5 o'clock ferry. Kelburn, 6 PM Sunday, birds in the woods. Glenuig, 3 PM Thursday, sheep, birds and the Loch Eilert post office chickens. And if you haven't been to Loch Eilert post office, I urge you to go. That's all I'm saying.